The morning of November 18th, 1943. USS Essex, steaming 200 miles northeast of Tarawa. Chief Aviation Machinist's mate Robert Dutch Hendricks stood on the carrier's flight deck watching a problem that shouldn't exist. Above him, at 12,000 feet, 6 F6F Hellcats from VF9 were engaged in a training dogfight with their own squadron mates, playing the role of Japanese Zeros. The Hellcats should have been dominating. They had more power, better protection, and superior firepower. But Dutch watched through binoculars as the simulated Zeros, flown by pilots mimicking Japanese tactics, consistently outturned and outclimbed the Hellcats in the crucial first 30 seconds of engagement. That 30-second window was where Pacific fighter combat was won or lost, and right now the Hellcats were losing it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. When the aircraft landed, Dutch was waiting at the revetment area with his toolbox and a clipboard full of questions. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, the squadron's executive officer and already a Medal of Honor recipient, climbed down from his Hellcat, shaking his head. The conversation that followed would be brief but consequential. "Chief, we've got a problem," O'Hare said, pulling off his leather helmet. "The book says this bird should outclimb a Zero above 14,000 feet. Maybe it does. But every fight starts lower than that, and in that first climb to altitude, they're beating us." Dutch had heard similar complaints from other pilots over the past 2 months. The F6F Hellcat had entered service in August, replacing the older F4F Wildcat. On paper, the Hellcat was superior in every measurable way. It was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2-80010 double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial producing 2,000 horsepower. The same engine that powered the P-47 Thunderbolt. The aircraft could reach 380 miles per hour in level flight and had a service ceiling of 37,000 feet. Its rate of climb was officially listed as 2,600 feet per minute, measured under standard test conditions with a clean aircraft and an experienced test pilot. But combat wasn't a test flight, and 2,600 feet per minute apparently wasn't fast enough when a Zero pilot saw you first and started climbing. Dutch had spent 22 years working on Navy aircraft. He'd maintained biplanes in the 1920s, radial engine fighters in the 30s, and now these new high-powered machines that pushed the boundaries of what piston engines could do. He understood something that sometimes got lost in engineering manuals and technical orders. There was a difference between what an aircraft could theoretically do and what it would actually do when a 22-year-old pilot was pulling the stick back hard because somebody was shooting at him. "Lieutenant Commander, when you're climbing in combat, are you following the recommended climb procedure from the manual?" Dutch asked. O'Hare looked at him like he'd asked if water was wet. "Of course. Airspeed 160 knots, mixture auto-rich, propeller 2400 RPM, manifold pressure 52 inches. Exactly what the book says." Dutch nodded slowly. He'd read that same manual. The recommended climb settings were designed to protect the engine from excessive stress and overheating. They represented a balance between performance and longevity. An engine operated at those settings could be expected to run for hundreds of hours between overhauls. But Dutch was starting to suspect that the manual's priorities and combat's priorities were not the same thing. That evening, after the flight deck had been secured and most of the squadron had gone below for evening chow, Dutch gathered his 3 senior mechanics in the maintenance office. Aviation Machinist's mates first class, Tom Morrison, Jake Sullivan, and Pete Kowalski had been with him since the Essex was commissioned. They were the kind of mechanics who could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone and who took personal offense when their aircraft didn't perform. "Gentlemen, I need opinions, not by the book answers," Dutch began. "The R2,800 inches are birds. What's actually limiting the climb rate when we follow the manual settings?" Sullivan spoke first. "Manifold pressure. We're holding it at 52 inches to keep cylinder head temperatures in the safe range. The engine can handle more, but the manual says 52 for continuous climb." "How much more can it handle?" Dutch asked. Morrison answered. The engine's rated for 60 inches manifold pressure at war emergency power, but that's only supposed to be used for 5 minutes maximum and only in combat emergencies. The restriction exists because sustained high manifold pressure increases cylinder head temperatures to levels that accelerate wear and increase the risk of detonation. What if, Dutch said carefully, we weren't worried about engine longevity? What if the question was purely about getting maximum climb rate for the first 60 seconds of combat? What would you change? The three mechanics exchanged glances. They understood what Dutch was asking, and they also understood the implications. The technical manuals existed for good reasons. Engines that were pushed too hard failed. Failed engines in combat meant dead pilots. But engines that couldn't get their pilots to altitude fast enough also meant dead pilots. Kowalski pulled out a worn notebook where he kept performance data he'd collected from various aircraft over his years of service. Chief, I've been tracking something. When pilots report using war emergency power during actual combat, the cylinder head temps do spike, but they don't go critical if the duration is kept short, and the performance gain is substantial. He flipped through his notes, showing columns of numbers recorded from post-flight inspections. Look at these readings from Lieutenant Rodriguez's bird after that fight near Rabaul last month. He used WEP for about 90 seconds during his initial climb. Cylinder heads hit 490 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hot but still below the 510-degree maximum, and according to his combat report, he gained altitude on the zero he was chasing. Dutch studied the numbers. The pattern was clear. Pilots who ignored the conservative climb settings and pushed their engines hard in the critical opening moments of combat reported better performance, and their engines, while stressed, weren't failing. The safety margins built into the manual settings were exactly that, margins. Room for error, allowance for wear, protection against the unexpected. But combat itself was the unexpected, and maybe different rules applied. Here's what we're going to do, Dutch said. Unofficial test. Tomorrow morning, before the first launch, I want you to prep Lieutenant O'Hare's bird exactly to manual specifications. But I'm going to have a conversation with him about what the engine can actually handle versus what the book says it should handle. If he chooses to explore the full performance envelope during a training flight, that's his decision as pilot in command. The unspoken understanding hung in the air. Dutch wasn't ordering anyone to violate technical procedures. He was simply going to ensure that a combat-experienced pilot understood the true capabilities of his aircraft, and then trust that pilot's judgment about how to employ those capabilities. If questions were asked later, Dutch would take responsibility. That was what chief petty officers did. The next morning, Dutch found O'Hare in the ready room reviewing the day's training schedule. He carried with him a single sheet of paper covered in handwritten notes and calculations. It wasn't an official document. It wouldn't appear in any maintenance log, but it represented Dutch's best understanding of what the R2800 engine could actually do when pushed to its limits. "Commander, do you have a minute?" Dutch asked. O'Hare looked up from his clipboard. "For you, Chief, always. What's on your mind?" Dutch laid out the paper on the table between them. "Sir, this is going to sound like I'm suggesting you ignore the technical manual. I'm not. I'm suggesting you understand what the manual's recommendations are really protecting against, so you can make informed decisions in combat." He pointed to the first set of numbers. "Standard climb settings give you 2,600 feet per minute. The manual limits you to 52 inches manifold pressure to protect engine longevity, but in combat, engine longevity might not be your primary concern." O'Hare leaned forward, his interest clearly engaged. Dutch continued. "If you advance the throttle to 60 inches manifold pressure, which is the engine's war emergency power rating, and adjust your climb speed to 140 knots instead of 160, the math suggests you could see climb rates approaching 3,200 feet per minute, maybe more." "The manual says WEP is limited to 5 minutes, O'Hare noted. "It does," Dutch agreed. But that limitation exists because sustained operation at those power settings will accelerate engine wear and increase maintenance requirements. For a 5-minute burst, the engine will handle it fine. Cylinder head temperatures will run hot but within tolerances. The question is whether gaining 600 feet per minute in a combat climb is worth the increased wear on the engine. O'Hare studied the numbers silently. Dutch knew what he was thinking. 600 feet per minute might not sound like much. But in a 60-second climb, that was 600 additional feet of altitude. In a dogfight, 600 feet of altitude advantage could mean the difference between being the hunter or the hunted. Chief, if I were to test this theory during today's training exercise, purely to evaluate combat performance under controlled conditions, would you have any technical concerns about the aircraft's ability to handle that stress? Dutch chose his words carefully. Sir, the aircraft is designed to operate at those power settings. The limitations in the manual are about long-term engine life, not immediate structural or mechanical failure. If you choose to explore the full performance envelope, I'm confident the bird will respond appropriately, and my team will conduct a thorough post-flight inspection to identify any adverse effects. O'Hare smiled slightly. Understood, Chief. I think today's training scenario just became a lot more interesting. 3 hours later, Dutch stood on the flight deck as the training mission launched. He'd briefed his mechanics to pay particular attention to O'Hare's aircraft during the post-flight inspection. They'd be checking cylinder head temperatures, examining spark plugs for signs of detonation, inspecting the turbo supercharger for stress indicators, and reviewing every system that would be affected by sustained high-power operation. The training lasted 45 minutes. When the Hellcats returned and began their landing pattern, Dutch noticed O'Hare's aircraft was leading the formation. That was unusual. Normally the XO flew in the middle of the pack during training. When O'Hare touched down and taxied to his parking spot, Dutch was waiting. The pilot climbed out, grinning. Chief, we need to talk. Privately. They walked to a quiet corner of the hangar deck, away from the noise and activity of flight operations. O'Hare pulled his kneeboard from his flight suit pocket and showed Dutch the notes he'd scrawled during the flight. Initial climb from deck level to 10,000 feet using standard settings, 4 minutes 12 seconds. Second climb, from 8,000 feet to 18,000 feet, using your suggested parameters, 3 minutes 8 seconds. O'Hare's voice carried barely contained excitement. Chief, I gained nearly 800 feet per minute, and the aircraft felt solid the entire time. No unusual vibrations, no roughness, nothing that suggested I was pushing too hard. Dutch felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with caution. How were your temperature readings? Cylinder heads peaked at 495 degrees during the climb. That's warm, but the gauge never went into the red. Oil temperature and pressure remained normal. Everything stayed in the green, just at the high end of green. Any signs of detonation? Roughness in the engine? None. Smooth as glass the whole way up. They were interrupted by Sullivan, who'd completed his post-flight inspection. Chief, I need to show you something. The three men walked to O'Hare's aircraft, where Sullivan had the cowling panels open, exposing the massive radial engine. He pointed to the spark plugs he'd already removed. Look at the electrode wear pattern, consistent with high-temperature combustion, but no signs of detonation damage. The plugs are working harder than during a standard climb, but they're well within acceptable limits. Over the next hour, the maintenance team conducted the most thorough inspection of Dutch's career. They measured, tested, photographed, and documented every system. The conclusion was consistent across all findings. The engine had been stressed, but not damaged. It had operated exactly as designed, delivering peak performance when called upon. That evening, Dutch compiled a report. Not an official document, he wasn't ready for that yet, but a detailed analysis of what they'd learned. The R-2800 engine was capable of sustained climb performance significantly beyond what the standard manual recommended, provided the pilot understood the trade-offs and managed the systems appropriately. The safety margins built into the manual served a purpose in peacetime operations and training flights. But combat was neither peaceful nor routine, and perhaps the manual's conservative settings were protecting against problems that mattered less when someone was actively trying to kill you. Word spread through the squadron quickly. Pilots talked to other pilots, comparing notes and experiences. Within a week, Dutch found himself conducting informal briefings for multiple aircrew, explaining the technical details of what the engines could actually handle versus what the book said they should handle. The unofficial nature of these sessions was important. Dutch never ordered anyone to deviate from manual procedures. He simply educated pilots about their aircraft's true capabilities and trusted them to make appropriate decisions. Some pilots continued flying by the book, comfortable with the standard settings. Others began experimenting with higher power settings during combat climbs, always within the engine's rated limits but beyond the manual's conservative recommendations. Lieutenant Commander O'Hare became the most vocal advocate for the technique. As XO, he had influence within the squadron and connections to other air groups throughout the task force. He began including discussions of climb performance in pilot briefings, sharing data from training flights and combat experiences. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. By December 1943, the practice had spread beyond VF9. Other squadrons aboard Essex and neighbouring carriers began experimenting with similar techniques. The modifications weren't mechanical. Dutch and his fellow mechanics never touched the engines or altered any hardware. The changes were purely operational, teaching pilots how to extract maximum performance from aircraft that had always been capable of it. The first major test came during the Gilbert Islands campaign. On November 20th, VF9 scrambled to intercept a formation of Japanese bombers approaching the task force. The Hellcats launched and immediately pushed into high-power climbs, using the techniques Dutch had helped develop. Within 90 seconds, they'd reached 15,000 feet, positioning themselves perfectly to dive on the incoming bombers from above. The intercept was devastatingly effective. The Japanese formation, accustomed to American fighters taking 3 to 4 minutes to reach combat altitude, found themselves under attack before they'd reached their release point. VF9 shot down 7 bombers without losing a single Hellcat. The speed of the American climb had caught the Japanese completely off guard. Post-mission analysis showed that the rapid climb had been crucial to the intercept's success. Under standard climb procedures, the Hellcats would have still been below 10,000 feet when the Japanese bombers reached their attack position. The extra 600 feet per minute had translated directly into tactical advantage. Dutch's maintenance logs from that period tell the story in technical detail. Increased cylinder head temperatures, slightly elevated oil consumption, spark plugs requiring more frequent replacement. The engines were working harder, running hotter, wearing faster. But they weren't failing, and the pilots were coming back alive. The informal nature of the modifications created an interesting situation. Officially, nothing had changed. The technical manuals still recommended the same conservative climb settings. Maintenance procedures remained standard. But within the fleet's fighter squadrons, a parallel understanding emerged. The manual represented peacetime operational norms, while combat demanded different calculations. Dutch never sought recognition for his role in developing these techniques. That wasn't why he'd done it. He was a chief petty officer, and chiefs took care of their people. In this case, his people were the pilots who flew the aircraft he maintained. If he could give them an advantage that helped them survive combat, the details of how that happened were less important than the result. The techniques did attract attention from higher command, though not always positive attention. In January 1944, a lieutenant commander from the Bureau of Aeronautics arrived aboard Essex to investigate reports that squadrons were deviating from standard operating procedures. Dutch found himself called to the commanding officer's stateroom to explain what had been happening. He brought his notes, his data, and his maintenance logs. He explained the technical details of what the R2800 could handle, the combat results that validated the approach, and the careful monitoring his team conducted to ensure aircraft safety. The WWII officer listened carefully, asked detailed questions, and reviewed the documentation. The officer's conclusion surprised Dutch. Rather than ordering a return to standard procedures, he acknowledged that combat operations sometimes required different approaches than peacetime training. However, he emphasized the need for proper documentation and systematic monitoring. If squadrons were going to operate beyond standard manual settings, they needed to do so with engineering oversight and proper data collection. What began as an unofficial practice aboard one carrier became the subject of formal study. The Bureau of Aeronautics, rather than suppressing the field innovations, chose to investigate whether they could be standardized and safely implemented across the fleet. Dutch received orders in February 1944 to travel to Naval Air Station Patuxent River in Maryland, where the Navy conducted its most rigorous aircraft testing. He arrived at Patuxent carrying 3 large binders filled with maintenance data, pilot reports, and performance measurements collected over 4 months of combat operations. The test pilots and engineers at Patuxent represented the Navy's most experienced aviation specialists, men who understood both the science of aircraft performance and the realities of combat flying. Commander Harold Hal Buell, a veteran dive bomber pilot who now led the fighter test division, greeted Dutch in a hangar where 2 F6F Hellcats sat waiting. "Chief Hendricks, we've been hearing interesting things about what you boys have been doing in the Pacific. The WWII wants us to verify your findings under controlled conditions and determine if we can develop standardized procedures." Over the next 3 weeks, Dutch worked alongside Patuxent's test pilots to systematically explore the F6F's climb performance envelope. They conducted dozens of test flights, measuring climb rates at various power settings, altitudes, and aircraft weights. They monitored every engine parameter, looking for signs of stress or impending failure. They pushed the aircraft hard, but always within the manufacturer's rated limits. The data confirmed what Dutch had observed in combat conditions. The R2800 engine could sustain significantly higher power settings than the manual recommended, provided pilots managed the systems properly and maintenance crews conducted appropriate inspections. The conservative settings in the standard manual provided comfortable safety margins for training operations and extended engine life, but they left substantial performance on the table. Commander Buell summarized the findings in a report that would eventually reach every fighter squadron in the Pacific Fleet. The F6F, operated at war emergency power settings during combat climbs and with proper technique, could achieve sustained climb rates of 3,200 feet per minute from sea level to 15,000 feet. This represented nearly a 25% improvement over standard manual procedures. The report included specific recommendations. Pilots should advance throttle to 60 inches manifold pressure during combat climbs. Climb speed should be reduced to 140 knots for optimal angle of climb. Mixture should remain in auto-rich to provide adequate cooling, and critically, these settings should be used only during combat or combat training, not during routine ferry flights or patrol operations. For maintenance crews, the report specified additional inspection requirements. Spark plugs should be examined after every 5 hours of high-power operation. Cylinder head temperature probes should be verified for accuracy monthly. Oil consumption should be tracked carefully. These were not burdensome requirements, but they acknowledged that extracting maximum performance required increased vigilance. By April 1944, when Dutch returned to the Essex, the informal techniques he'd helped develop had become semi-official doctrine. The term combat climb entered the vocabulary of fighter pilots throughout the fleet. Training syllabi were updated to include instruction on high-performance climb procedures. Maintenance manuals received supplements addressing the inspection requirements for aircraft regularly operated at high power settings. The impact on combat effectiveness was measurable. Fighter squadrons reported improved intercept success rates. The time required to reach combat altitude decreased significantly. Japanese pilots, accustomed to a certain performance baseline from American fighters, found themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered by Hellcats that climbed faster than expected. Lieutenant Alexander Vratsiu, who would become the Navy's fourth-ranking ace with 19 victories, later described the importance of climb performance in an interview conducted decades after the war. That first minute of a dogfight determined everything. If you could get above the enemy quickly, you controlled the engagement. The techniques we learned for maximizing climb rate weren't about fancy maneuvering or gunnery tricks. They were about understanding what your aircraft could really do and having the confidence to push it there. Vratsiu flew with VF6 aboard the USS Intrepid during the Marianas Campaign in June 1944. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the engagement that would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, he shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in a single mission. His post-combat report specifically mentioned using high-power climb settings to rapidly gain altitude advantage over incoming Japanese strike aircraft. The data from that battle provided compelling evidence of the tactical value of improved climb performance. American fighters intercepted Japanese strike packages earlier and at higher altitudes than in previous engagements. This forced Japanese bombers to defend themselves, rather than focusing on their attack runs, disrupting their formations and reducing their effectiveness against the American fleet. But the story of combat climb techniques involved more than just tactical success. It represented a broader shift in how the Navy approached aircraft operations. The rigid adherence to peacetime procedures gave way to a more nuanced understanding that combat required different calculations. Safety remained paramount, but safety meant bringing pilots home alive, not just protecting engines from excessive wear. Dutch Hendricks never received a medal for his contributions. The Navy didn't award decorations for maintenance innovations, and the unofficial nature of how the techniques developed meant there was no clear documentation of who deserved credit. Dutch wouldn't have wanted recognition anyway. When asked about it, years later, by a naval historian researching F6F operations, he deflected the question. "It wasn't one person's idea," Dutch said. "It was mechanics listening to pilots, pilots trusting mechanics, and everybody being willing to question whether the book was always right. The manual told us what we should do under ideal conditions. Combat wasn't ideal conditions, so we figured out what worked when conditions were terrible and somebody was shooting at you." The broader implications of the combat climb techniques extended beyond the F6F program. The lessons learned influenced how the Navy developed operating procedures for subsequent aircraft. The F4U Corsair, when it finally achieved widespread carrier operations in late 1944, benefited from similar analysis. Engineers and pilots worked together from the beginning to identify the difference between peacetime operating limits and combat performance envelopes. Post-war analysis by the Naval Aviation History Branch examined the factors that contributed to the Navy's overwhelming air superiority in the Pacific during 1944 and 1945. Superior numbers certainly played a role. American industrial capacity produced fighters faster than Japan could train pilots to fly them. Better tactics, developed through hard-won experience, gave American pilots advantages in combat. But the analysis also noted the importance of operational innovations that extracted maximum performance from existing aircraft. The combat climb techniques represented one example among many of how frontline personnel identified opportunities for improvement and implemented solutions without waiting for top-down directives. This institutional flexibility, the willingness to adapt and innovate under pressure, constituted a significant advantage that complemented material superiority. For the R2800 engine itself, the combat experience with high-power operations provided valuable data that influenced post-war aviation development. Pratt & Whitney engineers studied the maintenance logs and failure reports from engines that had been operated extensively at war emergency power. They learned that their conservative peacetime ratings had left substantial capability unused, and that with proper management, the engine could sustain higher power levels than originally specified. This knowledge influenced the development of the R2800's successors and contributed to the general understanding that piston engine ratings could safely be pushed beyond initial conservative estimates when operational. Our requirements justified the increased stress. The principle would carry forward into the jet age, where engine manufacturers learned to specify both continuous power ratings and combat power ratings, acknowledging that different situations demanded different approaches. The F6F Hellcat concluded its combat service with a record that few aircraft have matched. From its combat debut in August 1943 until the end of the war in August 1945, Hellcats were credited with destroying 5,156 enemy aircraft. This represented more than half of all Navy aerial victories in the Pacific. The aircraft achieved a kill ratio of 19-1, the best of any American fighter during the war. Those numbers reflected many factors: pilot training, tactical doctrine, numerical superiority, and the declining quality of Japanese opposition as experienced pilots were killed and poorly trained replacements took their places. But they also reflected an aircraft that had been optimized for combat through thousands of small improvements and adaptations, including the climb techniques that Dutch Hendricks and countless other mechanics and pilots had developed. Dutch remained in the Navy after the war, retiring in 1952 as a Master Chief Petty Officer. He'd served for 31 years, working on every generation of naval aircraft from fabric-covered biplanes to early jet fighters. When interviewed for a Naval Institute oral history project in 1978, he was asked what he considered his most important contribution to naval aviation. His answer was characteristic. Every time one of our pilots came back safe, that was important. Whether they came back because their engine ran right, or because their guns worked, or because I helped them understand what their bird could really do, that was the contribution. You don't measure success in maintenance by awards or recognition. You measure it by the guys who made it home. The 3 mechanics who had worked with Dutch aboard the Essex all remained in naval service as well. Tom Morrison retired as a senior chief in 1955. Jake Sullivan made Master Chief and served until 1958. Pete Kowalski transferred to the new jet programs and worked on F9F Panthers during the Korean War before retiring in 1956. All of them carried forward the lesson they'd learned during those months in 1943 and 1944. That technical manuals provided starting points, not ending points, and that understanding why limitations existed was more important than blindly following them. The techniques they pioneered became so thoroughly integrated into standard practice that by war's end, few people remembered they had ever been controversial or unofficial. New pilots received training in combat climb procedures as part of their standard syllabus. Maintenance crews conducted the enhanced inspections without considering them unusual. What had begun as a field innovation became simply the way things were done. Perhaps the most fitting recognition came not from the Navy but from Grumman, the F6F's manufacturer. In 1946, the company conducted a comprehensive review of the Hellcat program, analyzing what had made the aircraft so successful. The report, circulated internally but never widely published, included a section on operational innovations developed by fleet personnel. The section on climb performance techniques specifically mentioned the creative problem-solving of maintenance personnel and pilots who identified performance potential beyond initial conservative estimates. While it didn't name Dutch Hendricks, several Grumman engineers who had reviewed fleet maintenance logs during the war knew who had initiated the work. One of them, interviewed decades later, said simply, "We built a good airplane. The guys in the fleet made it better." The F6F remained in limited service until 1954, long after more advanced aircraft had replaced it in frontline roles. The last operational Hellcats flew as night fighters and target drones, their robust construction and reliable engines making them suitable for missions that didn't require cutting-edge performance. When the final F6F was retired and sent to storage, it carried a legacy that extended far beyond its 19-1 kill ratio. It represented a generation of warriors who had fought not just with courage but with ingenuity, who had questioned assumptions and tested boundaries, and who had understood that victory required both following the rules and knowing when the rules needed to be challenged. The combat climb techniques were just one small part of that story, but they exemplified the mindset that helped win the war. Today, restored F6Fs fly at air shows and museums, their massive radial engines roaring as they take to the sky. The pilots who fly these warbirds learn the same techniques that Dutch Hendricks helped develop 80 years ago. They advance the throttle to war emergency power. They hold 140 knots and pull back on the stick. They feel the aircraft surge upward at rates that still impress modern audiences. And sometimes, if you talk to these pilots after they land, they'll tell you about the men who maintained these aircraft during the war, the chiefs and the airmen who kept them flying under impossible conditions, who understood their machines at a level that transcended technical manuals, and who passed down knowledge that still informs how we operate historic aircraft today. The lesson Dutch Hendricks taught extends beyond aviation, beyond the military, beyond any specific time or technology. It's the lesson that expertise means understanding not just what the manual says, but why it says it. That innovation often comes from the people closest to the work, who see problems and possibilities that those farther removed might miss, and that the difference between adequate and excellent often lies in the willingness to ask one simple question: what else is possible? In 1994, 50 years after his work aboard the Essex, Dutch Hendricks died at age 76. His obituary in the Navy Times ran 4 paragraphs, mentioning his 3 decades of service and his retirement rank. It didn't mention F6Fs, or climb rates, or the techniques that had helped hundreds of pilots gain crucial altitude advantages in combat. But at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, where a beautifully restored F6F5 sits on display, a small placard tells part of the story. It explains how Navy maintenance personnel during World War II developed innovative techniques for maximizing aircraft performance under combat conditions. It mentions the importance of understanding an aircraft's true capabilities versus its peacetime limitations, and it concludes with a line that Dutch himself might have written: "Excellence in naval aviation has always depended on the skill and dedication of the men and women who maintain the aircraft and support the pilots who fly them." The sky above the Pacific saw many battles during World War II, and the F6F Hellcat participated in most of them. Each combat sortie, each intercept, each successful mission represented the culmination of thousands of individual actions and decisions. Pilots who flew skillfully, ordnancemen who loaded guns and bombs, plane captains who conducted pre-flight inspections, and mechanics like Dutch Hendricks, who understood that their job wasn't just to keep aircraft running, but to help them perform at their absolute best when performance mattered most. The combat climb techniques they developed didn't win the war by themselves. No single innovation or piece of equipment or tactical doctrine did that. But they contributed, one flight at a time, one extra 100 feet of altitude at a time, one pilot who came home safe at a time. And in the aggregate, across thousands of combat missions and hundreds of thousands of flight hours, those small advantages added up to something significant. They added up to victory. Not dramatic or cinematic victory, but the steady, grinding, incremental kind of victory that comes from doing countless small things right, from never accepting good enough when better was possible, and from understanding that the difference between success and failure in combat, often measured in seconds and feet, and decisions that happened too fast for anyone watching from the outside to even notice. That was Dutch Hendricks's legacy. Not a medal or a plaque or a place in history books, just the knowledge that he'd done his job as well as anyone could, that the pilots who flew the aircraft he maintained had every possible advantage he could give them, and that when the war ended and they came home, some of them came home because he'd helped them understand what their aircraft could really do. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.